Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our research series. I'm really excited about today's session. It's research integrity, and we have two very excellent presenters today, one from Virginia Tech and one from Trilling Clinic. So our presenter from Virginia Tech is Dr. Iris Jenkins. She holds a PhD from UMass Amherst in neuroscience and behavior, and she also has 14 years of experience in this area at UMass, numerous roles and responsibilities. And she came to Virginia Tech late last year in 2024. Katie Tomlinson is our research compliance specialist. She holds a BS in health sciences from James Madison University. She has 6 years of clinical patient experience in addition to her 2 years and 2.5 years in her present role as our research compliance specialist. So I think this will be a give and take presentation. The information should be relevant to both Virginia Tech and Trilling Clinic. So put your questions in the chat and there'll be people that'll be monitoring that. So thank you, ladies, for presenting.
Thank you, Francis.
Thank you. So I guess I'll go ahead and get started, and you now know who we are, so we can move to the next slide. All right, so I just wanted to start with kind of thinking about what we mean when we say research integrity. And so when we talk about research integrity, there are values that our communities, our research communities hold dear. There are principles such as honesty and transparency when we're conducting our research, that we are doing our best to be accurate, but also objective and fair throughout the entire research process. So that means whether we are at the proposal stage, there's something to think about in terms of integrity, or we're actually conducting the research, or even when we're disseminating the research. We are making decisions about how we can do that ethically. What's the best question to ask? What are the best methods that we're going to use to answer those questions? What is the appropriate analysis? Who's going to be impacted by our research? All of those are taken into consideration so that we can have high standards of, I want to be accurate, I want to be objective and fair throughout the entire research process. And even when we're choosing where we choose to share our data that we've gotten, once we're ready to publish, we make a decision about where that should be shared, who's the audience we want to reach, who's going to be impacted by it. All of those are related to research integrity. And you know, one of the really important things is that we consider that the way we conduct research, if we're not doing it with integrity, then it's impacting not just the people we work with, but the people who are relying on that information and the public trust in the research enterprise. So just thinking about all of those things should kind of have us thinking that it's not limited to one part of our research process, but integrity is throughout. Next slide, please. And so what does our field expect of us, right? So as researchers, there are our shared values I mentioned already, you know, that we're honest, objective, transparent, that we are operating with accuracy, and also reproducibility, that, you know, if somebody tries to reproduce our work, it should be possible to do so, because we're saying that this is how we came to these results, right? So we have these obligations to honor the trust that our colleagues put into us. We have to consider our own personal integrity and the impact on the public. And part of working in this research integrity space is our ability to engage in moral reasoning. So ethical decision making. When we have situations where the regs don't tell us exactly what we should do, we have to figure out how to move forward ethically. So having kind of a sensitivity to the fact that there are ethical questions that may be outside of the regulatory framework. So ourselves as researchers having this commitment to making moral decisions and implementing them, right? So like not just recognizing that there are ethical dilemmas, but saying we're committed to trying to work through them in an appropriate manner. Next slide, please. And so when we talk about research excellence, like we always say, like research integrity, you know, you get there by operating in research excellence, right? We can do excellent research. Research done with integrity is excellent work. And when we talk about research excellence, what are we talking about? Well, there's kind of three components, right? There's what we can do and what we must do and what we should do. And so next slide, please. So when we talk about what we can do, we're talking about our methods, our procedures. And many of us get taught that, right? Before, sometimes we haven't heard about research integrity and ethics for quite some time. And we've been honing our skills and learning the methods that we're going to do in our research settings. Next slide, please. And then there's the regulations, right? What we can do, like what we must do. Sorry. We have what we can do, our procedures, but what we must do, we have to do those procedures within the confines of regulations. And this is where, depending on your research, you might interact with the biosafety committee, right? You might interact with the institutional review board if you're doing human work, or the animal care and use program. There are regulations that we have to follow. And then there's also what we should do. And so next slide, please. And that's where we get the ethics, right? There's our procedures that we often get really strengthened in. There's our regulations that say this is what your limitations are. This is what you have to do in order to be in compliance with the law. And then there's ethics, which really are about what should we do. And you can imagine that there are scenarios where our ethics are apart from the regulations. And just to give you an example, we're talking about human subjects work. The regulations that we have don't necessarily take into account social media. They were developed before then, right? So now we have research that's taking place on social media. We have an ethical framework that says we want to minimize risk to participants. And so that's where we talk about our ethics. What should we do when we don't have this regulatory framework that tells us exactly what? Next slide, please. And so I said before, many of us are trained on our methods and we are really skilled at that, but we have an imbalance because we may know some about the regulations and we may feel, I am doing human work, I am submitting to an IRB, check, I'm done with ethics. But as I just explained, there could be things that we need to consider that are not in the regulations. And so next slide, please. And so this is what happens, right? Things fall apart because we are too heavily focused on methods and not considering the regulations and the ethical part of our work. Next slide, please. And so what we really want is to have a balance, right? We want to balance our knowledge of our methods and be really good at those, but we also want to be familiar and working within those regulations that are requirements for us. And those could be federal regulations, they could be state, they could be institutional policies. But regardless, we have things that we have to work within. And then there's that ethical portion that is like, I can make decisions for the betterment of this research that are not guided by the regulations, but they are just ethical decisions that come up. And so I think I am stopping, and next slide we'll start with Katie.
Thanks, Dr. Jenkins. So now that we've defined research integrity, what's expected of us, and how we can achieve research excellence, let's dive into how research misconduct is defined by the federal regulations. So it's defined by 42 CFR 93 by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and by 45 CFR 689 by the National Science Foundation. And it's defined as unethical behavior in various stages of research, which does include proposing, performing, reviewing, or in reporting research results. So those unethical behaviors are really broken down into three main forms. So that is what we're going to call our FFP: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So fabrication includes making up data or results and recording or reporting them as actual or real data. Falsification includes manipulating materials, equipment, processes, changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the record. And then we also have plagiarism, which is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving the appropriate credit. Now, not every or any mistake is included or encompassed in research misconduct. Research misconduct does not include honest errors or differences in opinion, which is why it's really important for us to maintain transparency and open discussions to maintain our ethical research practices. Next slide, please. So here I have a graph that depicts retractions in health science research since the year 2000. As we can see, the prevalence has significantly increased since the year 2000. This graph is from the Retraction Watch database, which is a well-known resource that tracks retractions and scientific integrity issues in the scientific community. And so with this significant increase in trend, what can we sort of determine and gather from this data? Do we think that there's increased scrutiny and accountability in research since there's a lot more retractions occurring? I think it also speaks to the need for rigorous oversight and compliance with ethical standards as we conduct research. So for both students and faculty, this serves as an important reminder for our responsibility to uphold the highest standards of research integrity. Retractions not only impact individual careers, but they can also erode the public trust in the research that we perform. Next slide, please. So here I have another graph. This is from a researcher named Finelli in 2009, who performed a systematic review which examined the prevalence of questionable research practices in the scientific community. So as we can see here, in this first category here, it examined responses of folks who admitted to committing questionable research practices. We can see that number is relatively low. And then as we move on to our second category of responses of researchers who are aware of colleagues who have also committed questionable research practices, we see a higher prevalence of admission. And then when we jump over to our final category on the far right, we have admission rates from researchers who know of cases of bias or fraud, and that is the highest admission rate. So what are the trends that we're seeing here? So while we are seeing that self-reported misconduct or questionable research practices may be low, we are still seeing on the other end of that, that many researchers are aware of unethical practices that are happening around them. So this can also speak to the challenges that we encounter trying to address integrity issues in research. So it is crucial for all of us as researchers, educators, and future healthcare professionals to recognize the importance of maintaining ethical research practices. And by being aware of the prevalence of these issues, we can work towards fostering a culture of integrity and accountability in research. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to talk a bit about consequences of research misconduct. And of course, engaging in research misconduct has professional consequences, right? One is a loss of credibility. If you are found to have fabricated or falsified your data or even plagiarized, it's going to say something about your credibility as a researcher. But more than that, there are kind of professional and academic consequences that may combine. So for example, if at Virginia Tech there is a number of cases of fabrication or falsification, people will say, what's happening? It's gonna, like, what's going on at Virginia Tech that so many people are doing this? Is there not education there? Are people just unaware? Are they a bunch of bad researchers? We talked about public trust in the research enterprise. So, reputational harm can certainly come to the individual, but also to the institution. It could result in a loss of funding, right? If you were funded to do research that turns out you fabricated or falsified, it's possible that you could have to repay funds, or your institution could have to repay funds, or you could be barred from obtaining funding in the future. These are real possibilities. You could be disqualified from receiving funding or for serving as a reviewer, right? Because sometimes I mentioned that this kind of process of research integrity is throughout the research project. So it could be at the proposal stage, and you could say, I didn't even get funded for that, but you proposed something with faulty data. Like, that matters just as much as the person who published something that was fabricated. All of those things could result in, oh, well, you will not be interacting with the funding agency and receiving funds that way. It could result in a person having to have increased oversight, like somebody who's been doing research for years, who's been now found to have research misconduct, could be told you're not allowed to continue without oversight. You're not allowed to do research on your own anymore. And then there's, of course, harm to the credibility of science, as we said, with things like Retraction Watch. These are public databases where retractions are, there every day and open for the public to see. Some of the things that happen in science regarding research misconduct become public news stories. The public is seeing these things, and it harms the credibility of science. And of course, we need public support to do our research, right? We're supposed to be doing it for the public. And so what happens when all they're seeing is that, oh, funding was given to this person to do this amazing work, and it turns out that the results that they came up with were falsified or fabricated. So not only is the public trust diminished, but the people who were relying on those results, right? People who are now building research programs off of faulty data are also impacted. So there's a lot of consequences. Next slide, please. And just to say, I wanted to show this. So for those projects that are federally funded and research misconduct is found, the Federal Office of Research Integrity does post those cases to the public. You can see here their website, which any of you can visit. It lists the names of the people who committed the research misconduct. Next slide, please. And it shows a case summary. So I just pulled one forward, and it tells all of the details. So what were the allegations? What were they found to have done? And any sanctions that were imposed, if they were barred from receiving funding, if they have to have federal oversight, all of that is there. So it is kind of a naming and shaming that the Federal Office of Research Integrity does when people are found in research misconduct. And these cases remain on the website until the sanctions are complete. So if you have someone, for example, who is barred permanently from ever receiving funds, then their case will stay on that website. And so you'll see on that list, if you go, there's some really old cases because there were kind of permanent consequences. If it was like you can't apply for funding for 3 years, then it would come off in 3 years. But sometimes those sanctions are very very lengthy. And sometimes, they're in addition to institutional things, right? These are the federal sanctions, but your institution could certainly terminate a person over research misconduct or have some other institutional disciplinary action. Next slide, please. And then this is just to say that for those who get NSF funding, they also have a semi-annual report to Congress on findings of research misconduct. So in this case, they're not naming names as ORI does, but they do outline all of the cases that they've had. And so all of that to say that it just isn't good for the individual, for the institution, and for science when we have continued cases of research misconduct. I believe the next slide will go to Katie.
So we are gonna put up a poll here. Is it research misbehavior or research misconduct? Can you identify misbehavior? So your options are A, B, or C. If you would complete the poll, and we'll see how you guys are thinking about this. We'll give you a minute to submit your answers. And JT, will I be able to see the results of the poll? Thank you.
All right, I'll go ahead and share the results.
So interestingly enough, we have about split almost 50-50 between A and C, sloppy notebook, exaggerating meaning of results. So the correct answer for this one is A, sloppy notebook. We are categorizing as misbehavior. So with B and C, we're getting more into the area of potential research misconduct. Next slide, JT, please. Thank you all for completing the poll and engaging with us. So the National Academy of Sciences has determined that there are research practices that are no longer questionable and are in fact detrimental. So those practices do include gratuitous authorship or denying authorship, not retaining data or other materials as expected, neglectful or exploitive supervision, misleading statistical analysis, lack of policies, procedures, or capacity to create an environment to support integrity, and then abusive or irresponsible publication practices. So we really want to focus on how can we ensure we are not falling into these practices, whether we're conscious of it or not. We want to make sure we're evaluating our processes, and as we work through all the phases of research to make sure that we are upholding ethical research practices. Next slide, please. So we have a couple case studies we're going to review with you and try to get some engagement here. So I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Jenkins to go over our first case study.
Next slide, please. So just keeping in mind as we go into these that research misconduct is limited to FFP, as Katie spoke about earlier, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. And then also that there may be, as Katie outlined, detrimental research practices, right? That may not be falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism, but are nonetheless harmful. So just keep that in mind as we go through these. And I'm going to just read through these, and then we will have a poll and discussion. So this one, mine, not ours. A former grad student contacted the research integrity officer and said that their former faculty advisor had published research without giving them appropriate credit. According to the former grad student, the faculty member had co-authored a manuscript that reference ideas and use methods that the former grad student believed they created without giving them appropriate credit. The use of their intellectual property was particularly distressing to the former grad student because they believed that a lack of publications and citation is limiting their ability to gain employment. Next slide, please. So the faculty member responds to the former grad student's complaint by saying that the former grad student is trying to lay claim to tools and analysis techniques that are widely used by other research teams in the field. The faculty member also agreed that there are similarities between the former grad student's dissertation and the article in question, but claimed that the research described in the article is from a different study. And then the faculty member concluded their rebuttal by saying that they have strongly encouraged the former grad student to publish their work, but the former grad student never submitted their research to any journal. Therefore, the faculty member believes that it's impossible for them to cite the former grad student's work in the event that a citation is even necessary. So there's our scenario. Next slide, please. And so we have a poll question first based on that scenario. And we can go to the next slide and show it, and then I think JT will give us the poll. So based on the information provided, do you think this is research misconduct? And we have yes, no, I don't know. I get to see what the results are.
Yeah, we're at 60% participation.
People are thinking about it.
Yeah.
So just in summary, while we're waiting, former grad student is saying, you know, my faculty advisor is basically taking credit for my work, has published a paper that I'm not on, but it uses my ideas and methods. And the rebuttal from the faculty member is, well, one, these methods are used widely in the field. It's not yours. This is a different project, although it is similar. And also, you know, I encouraged you to publish. You never did, so I can't cite you. So that's kind of a brief summary. Okay, so we have 30% saying yes, most are saying no, and then I don't know, 20%. So we got a good mix here. We're gonna go to the next slide and see if we can get some of you to share. So next slide. Okay, why? So some people said yes, some people said no. Is anybody willing to share? Why do you think this is or isn't research misconduct? And you can, you know, speak out loud or you can put something in the chat. But whatever side you fell on, do you have an opinion why? Why did you choose that?
I'm not sure how one can render an opinion without knowing the individuals involved and their credibility and credentials. And
Yep.
I won't get into politics, but truthfully,
Yeah.
so that's how I feel. I answered, I don't know. I've been to
Yep.
grad school as well as med school. I know how that these things occur.
Yep.
So I think it's very difficult without knowing the individuals, truthfully.
And I think that's a good point. When we get research misconduct cases, so I serve as a research integrity officer here, sometimes the start of it is just like what you've gotten. And so identifying what additional information is needed is important.
Yeah, I
Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
know, because I think the science in general was not in question, but the professionalism, the ethical treatment of people, and the dissemination it was at fault.
Yeah, so one of the things that often comes up with research misconduct is somebody will say, this person plagiarized me. And when we get into it, it turns out it's actually an authorship dispute. And so that is not considered research misconduct. An authorship dispute is, I think I should have gotten some credit, unless it really is plagiarism. And sometimes it turns out it's not plagiarism. It's that they didn't like the way they were cited, or maybe they didn't do enough work that warrants authorship, right? So like all of those things come into play. So that's another good point. Could be something else other than research misconduct. And in order for this to be research misconduct, it really would have to be FP. And in this case, it would have to be plagiarism. And let's remember that plagiarism does include not just text though, but ideas. So how do you show that? That can be quite difficult, that this was my idea first, you stole my idea. Anybody else before we go to the next question? Thank you for those who answered. Okay, next slide, please. And this one came up a bit. Yep, we'll just handle this all together. What additional information might you need to determine if this situation is or is not research misconduct? And so in this case, we are talking about plagiarism. One thing that has already come up was, you know, the people involved might make a difference. Right? Is there anything else you think you'd need to know?
Yeah, personally, I would want to read the paper about which the graduate student is concerned in detail, familiarize myself with the background involved, and then ask the graduate student, show me the basis for your thinking you have ownership. And I mean, I think if it's in his dissertation, then I'll read his dissertation. I mean, this takes time.
It does, absolutely. Everything that you're saying is right on target with what we do as, you know, research integrity officers. We're looking, you know, to get a committee together that's going to review all of this stuff. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying, well, show me where it was. It has to be specific, right? It can't be just like, this person plagiarized me. Show me where. Show me what was the publication that you're alleging they plagiarized in. What did they plagiarize from you? Whether it's a dissertation, and we do get those. I had a case recently where a grad student said I was plagiarized by my advisor. And showed me, here's, and had done his own kind of like, running it through a plagiarism check. Here's my dissertation draft, here's the publication, this is plagiarized. And in that case, for the first time ever, I had an admittance from the faculty member saying I did, I did do this. So that would be considered research misconduct. It's actual plagiarism. So needing to see those things is important. Is there anything else? And what about if this information did exist, as we said, we got a hold of the thesis, it's not published, but it's there. Can a researcher cite unpublished work? How would they do that?
In the text, in parentheses, personal communication or whatever it might be, yeah.
Totally agree. And like sometimes people think they can't. Was somebody else gonna say something?
It's done all the time, to Dr. Slutner's point.
Right. And so like that can't be the excuse that it wasn't published, so I couldn't cite it, right? And then that does raise something different. If it was cited as, unpublished manuscript, would that student still be able to say, well, they plagiarized me? Not if it was cited, right? They might then have an authorship dispute and come to us and say, I should have been an author on this paper. And that's what often happens. We end up with somebody coming with a plagiarism, and then when we get down to it, sometimes it's even they were acknowledged in the acknowledgement section of the paper, and they say, I should have been an author. And so for us, it's like, well, you did get some recognition. You need to work out whether it was appropriate or not. But sometimes, people don't go into it with an understanding of what they're going to get out of it. Maybe you're doing data collection and you have no idea like what the hypothesis is. You don't have any intellectual contribution to the project other than I'm just collecting a bunch of data, and you could do that for hours. It could be so much work to collect data, but it may not still rise to the level of authorship if you're not involved in any of the analysis. You don't have any opinions about what's happened. You just were providing something. But that's something to be worked out beforehand. So I think that's it, unless somebody else has something to say about this. We can move on to the next slide, and I think the next one will be Katie's. Oh, I'll stop. I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. Just some themes and issues that come out of this. One is ownership of ideas. Remember, plagiarism also covers that. So just thinking about this scenario is thinking about like, whose idea was it first and how do you determine that? And then the theme of the importance of publication to a career in academia. Like we know these publications are like currency. So sometimes, that plays into how badly somebody's wanting credit for something. And then the last thing is just interpersonal disputes. We get a lot of things that come to us and say, this is research misconduct, and it turns out it doesn't fall into FFP, but it is an interpersonal dispute. It's something that the people are just not getting along. I mentioned authorship disputes, where it's really about appropriate credit and it doesn't really fall under plagiarism. And then there's research misconduct, which again, falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. So like when we're thinking about cases of research integrity, there's a lot of things that can come up, and we really have to focus ourselves, those of us that are doing the reviews, on like, does it fall into this? And it may be a detrimental research practice, or it may be bad behavior in general. I've had people come to me and say, this is research misconduct because they harassed me during the course of collecting data, right? And so it's like, it's bad behavior. Maybe I need to contact Title IX, but it's not for this process, which is limited to FFP. And with that, I think I'm turning it over to Katie this time.
Thanks, Dr. Jenkins. So our next case study is all about the data. So where is the data? So we have a current graduate student who is asked to conduct additional analysis on a data that was collected by a former graduate student. Next bullet, please, JT. And the current graduate student was unable to replicate the former student's results. Next, please. The current student believed that the former student may have fabricated or falsified data, so they contacted the research integrity officer. Next slide, please. The questionable data had been published, but only made up a small portion of the manuscript. Next, please. A research misconduct review was initiated, and the committee requested copies of the original data produced by the piece of equipment that was used to run the test. Next one. The record produced by the machine was an Excel document, and it was impossible to determine who made the changes to the data before it was submitted to the journal. Next, please. The committee then requested the former graduate student's lab notebook, but it was scant on details. Next. A review of the electronic research record did not provide any additional clarity. Next, please. When asked why they didn't catch the manipulated data during the review process, the faculty advisor indicated that they trusted the student and didn't want to micromanage them. Next, please. And we'll have a poll question. Do you think this was research misconduct? Yes, no, I don't know. I'll give you guys some time.
Research misconduct on the part of the student or on the part of the,
I would say the student, the former student.
I won't make any grammatical comments about slides.
So just another overcap. Current student identified possible FF on behalf of the former student, but on the review, it couldn't be confirmed based on the fact that the Excel document, we couldn't determine who made the changes, and the former student's notebook did not have much details, and then the electronic record did not provide any additional clarity. And the faculty member trusted the student and didn't want to micromanage them, so they didn't catch any manipulated data. So the poll results are in, and we have 60% with yes, 35% with I don't know, and 5% with no. I am gonna kind of talk about both sides of this case because we really don't have proof of falsification or fabrication, right? We don't have any data that proves it was manipulated by the former student. So I would almost argue that we can't actually confirm this as research misconduct. Iris, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to confirm. And I think even if we could, one of the issues would be like, who's responsible, right? So like, do we have any evidence that the former student actually manipulated something? Or if the data looks strange, I'm saying this because we've had a similar case where the data did look strange, but we were unable to determine who messed with it. And so part of the research misconduct process is like saying, has research misconduct occurred and to what extent and by whom? And so like all we were able to do in that case is to say like, okay, we can tell something happened. We don't have anybody that we could say engaged in research misconduct, but we are concerned about the record, the research record. So to contact the journal and just tell them that our research misconduct finding is that there is something weird with this data you might want to publish or say something about. But yeah, it's hard to tell.
Thank you. JT, we can go to the next slide, and I'm going to open it up to some discussion. Next one, please. So for those of you that do think it was research misconduct, do you want to add any thoughts?
This is Dr. Bancoli. I wanted to ask a question first. So in the last scenario we discussed, could we say that there was research misconduct, but we don't know who perpetrated the misconduct? Because objectively, the PI has overall responsibility for the whole of the research team, regardless of who perpetrated it?
I would agree that we could say it occurred, but whose name do you put on it? If we can't, acknowledging the PI is ultimately responsible for the project, do we say that because of the lack of oversight, that we are gonna hold the PI accountable for the research misconduct that occurred? Or on the other hand, would we say, because we can't say that the PI actually committed the research misconduct, should he be held and actually, you know, held responsible for research misconduct if we truly can't confirm that that individual did it? I really appreciate the discussion. This is one of those gray area cases that I'm sure occurs across the board, and the things that these research misconduct committees are responsible for hashing out and determining, and it really is just a group of people gathered to review the evidence and make the best determination that they have based on the evidence presented. Any other discussions?
Yeah, I think what's at stake here is the two terms that are used a lot in science is massaging the data or cherry picking, and likely either one of those things occurred. One thing though, when you do publish a journal, you do check to say that every author is responsible for the content of that manuscript. So it's a little bit different in clinical research where a lot of that burden goes to the PI, whereas I think in published work, it goes to every author.
That's
you.
such a good point. I was just going to add to that, Katie, if you don't mind, like the
Absolutely.
same thing about what you were saying about every author being responsible. When it's before it's published, it makes it a little bit harder for us. But once it's published, if we're working with a paper and there's some sort of issue of research misconduct, it's either the first author or the corresponding author who gets the notification first about this. And then ultimately everybody on the paper suffers, right? Because even if we can't identify who did it, like the fact that we're going to the journal and saying there's something here that's not right, it could get retracted, and that's a retraction for everybody.
JT, we can add the last two discussion questions on the screen. So I open it up again to anybody who wants to add here. What are the responsibilities of faculty in ensuring research integrity? And can you think of any processes or safeguards that could have been put into place with this particular case to prevent such issues from arising? So while we know there's clear lack of documentation and even lack of sort of a version control process, whether that be electronic or not, proper data management practices are crucial, including detailed notebooks. That way we can ensure the reproducibility. And then with the responsibility of the faculty member, while we do acknowledge it's important to the mentor-mentee relationship to maintain trust, it must be balanced with appropriate oversight by the faculty. And so, you know, those are some things that we want to make sure we're thinking about as we are working through research and trying to, you know, adhere to these ethical standards. We can go to the next slide, JT. Thank you. So again, you know, as I discussed, our data management, record keeping, and adequate oversight are crucial. And then I did want to add that, you know, academic environments do often come with high expectations to publish or produce results, which can sometimes lead individuals to engage in questionable research practices. So understanding and addressing these pressures is also key to fostering a culture where integrity is prioritized. And so again, we can work together to establish these best practices to kind of make sure issues that arise in this case don't arise in the future. Next slide, JT. And Iris is going to talk about the responsible conduct of research.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. So we've been talking a lot about decision making, and you know, we did a couple of case studies now where, you know, you all walked through the process that many inquiry investigation committees for research misconduct, they do the same thing. They are looking at what's in front of them, trying to figure out what information that they need to be able to make a decision about whether research misconduct has occurred. Just some things to think about, as we work toward research excellence. Again, we want to have a balance of our methods, our understanding and implementation of regulations, and then address the ethical issues, not just identify, but address them. And so in doing that, we have to remember that not all problems can be anticipated. So even when we have gone through the institutional review board and gotten our check and go ahead, we're approved to do work, there will be ethical things that come up and we can't anticipate them. But we also can't address our ethical challenges if they go unrecognized. So part of this is thinking beyond that compliance part, right? Trying to get us to think that just because I got IRB approval or IACUC approval or any other institutional approval, there are still ethical decisions that I have to make. And often that's what happens when we talk about research misconduct. It's like, it's not they didn't get approval to do the work from a compliance committee, right? They may have IRB approval. It's not that even maybe they're working with human participants and they're treating them wonderfully, but it's the data part. Now it's like, oh, I really need a publication. I really need to have data to get a grant or whatever the pressures are. They might not acknowledge that as an ethical issue or an ethical challenge that needs to be addressed. Not all ethical challenges have corresponding research regulations, right? So there aren't always regulations to go to and say, what should I do in this scenario? And ethical challenges can often have more than one right answer. And I think when we talk about research ethics, it's acknowledging the fact that there may be multiple ways to solve an ethical dilemma, and we're trying to find which one is the best. It might not be a yes or no, as it can be with the regulations. And then communicating our ethical reasoning is essential. So when we decide to do something in our research where we've made an ethical decision, having kind of an explanation that here's how we came to this decision is important. I mentioned before about social media and how when our regulations around human research protections were written, there was not this context to think about. So when you are working now saying, I'm going to go online and I'm going to harvest data from social media, maybe you want to go on Facebook and you're looking for a particular population and you just want to look at what they've put out there. There might not be regulations that say, no, you can't do that. Or, you have to do it a certain way. But the ethical framework is, okay, we're minimizing risk to participants. What's the best way we can do that? What are the options or alternatives that we have for minimizing risk in that scenario where the regs are silent? And then after we've done that, making sure that we're able to communicate how we came to that point. What did we consider? Next slide, please. And so we want to always conduct our research with integrity. Next slide, please. Upholding our key elements that we talked about: honesty, objectivity, transparency, accuracy, and reproducibility. We want to always have those things in mind. Next bullet, please. And acknowledge limitations. So in our research, if there are uncertainties, errors, and limitations, we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge even opposing views, right? To say that we've considered that somebody might think this should be done differently. And we've actually thought about that, and here's why we've chosen to proceed the way that we have. Next bullet, please. Giving proper credit to those who make the research possible. It's really important because, like I said, we get lots of authorship disputes that are really about credit and who should get credit. And this is something that research teams should work on from the beginning. Sometimes roles change and maybe something that warranted authorship in the beginning now doesn't based on the role that the person is doing. Or maybe somebody has now increased what they're doing on a project and it rises to the level of authorship. But just giving proper credit, whether that is authorship or an acknowledgement of the person's contribution. Next bullet, please. Obtaining the compliance approvals, right? That's the regulatory portion of it. As we talked about ethics, we talked about compliance or regulation. So prior to doing any research, making sure that you have the proper approvals in place. Next bullet, please. Reporting conflicts of interest. We didn't talk much about that, but that's another compliance area, right? Because it speaks to objectivity if we're able to manage conflicts of interest. Next bullet, please. And then maintaining accurate records, right? So documenting and following our research plans, making sure that we have high expectations for accuracy and that we verify results and report our findings. All of that is part of the research process and conducting it with integrity. It's not just the compliance piece, but that is very important. But it's also, you know, our record keeping, our not being sloppy, our not engaging in detrimental research practices. Next slide, please. And I think
Back off of all of the crucial points that Dr. Jenkins just pointed out, we also want to make sure that we are collaborating responsibly. So including making sure that our roles are clearly defined and authorship expectations are outlined and maintaining that open communication line. And then in addition to that, we want to make sure we're promoting ethical research culture. We have a handful of things in our arsenal currently to help us with that. That includes our code of ethics, institutional policies, our regulations, and our own personal convictions. And then lastly, you know, we want to ensure training is maintained on these topics. Thank you to everyone that's here today working on making sure they're trained on this really important topic. And we want to continue that training and make sure we're continually developing our moral reasoning and maintaining good mentor-mentee relationships that also include oversight and, you know, maintaining those ethical standards. Next slide, JT. And then we're going to dive into who reports what, where do you report it between our two institutions as we navigate continued collaboration and research. Next slide.
So I'll talk about Virginia Tech. So Virginia Tech allegations of research misconduct are typically reported to me, the research integrity officer, either by email, by phone, but we do allow for anonymous reports. Sometimes I've gotten emails, you know, where it's clearly, you know, it doesn't have their name, right? It's an email address that they made up for the purpose of doing this, or is just not clear who they are. We have to take those things into consideration, specifically, and if they are specific about the allegation, if they're telling us something specific and it's a reality, there's a paper or something they're pointing to, or they have some evidence that they're presenting, we have to take it. So we also have an integrity email address that people reach out to. And here at Virginia Tech, if you are on campus, people have walked into the office and shared it. We basically take them however we get them, and we're going to follow up. We don't currently have a platform for submitting them other than email, phone, or walk-in, but people are welcome to get them to me however they can. And I think Katie will take the next slide.
So reporting research misconduct at Carilion, we have a handful of options that you can take to make this sort of report. You can call our integrity helpline at the 844 number listed. We also recently added a research misconduct report option to our compliance portal where you can report various compliance related concerns. So you would go to the link compliance.carillionclinic.org. You select begin the report, and then it pulls up what you see here in the picture is the different options of a report that you might want to make. You would select research misconduct and click next. And with this specific method, you have the option to submit the report anonymously. It has a drop-down option of whether you want to remain anonymous, and you fill out the details and it comes right to our office. In addition to that, you can email researchcompliance@carillionclinic.org, or you can email Carillion's Research Integrity Officer directly, which is Kristen Metter, our Chief Compliance Officer as well, and I have her email listed on the screen. So that is all that we have for you guys today. I want to take the time to really thank Dr. Jenkins. It's been really wonderful to collaborate on this presentation with you. And we really appreciate all your time. Does anybody have any questions?
So I put 3 references in the chat. One is about a famous NIH scientist in Alzheimer's research. It was in Science magazine end of 2024, where he controlled a huge budget at the NIH, and his fraudulent research had ramifications for clinical trials that was based on that. The second one was a good book that I read called Rigor Mortis, and it's just a general thing about how sloppy science leads to bad outcomes. And then the last one, this is for people like me that are old timers that went to grad school in the 90s. It's the David Baltimore case. And this accusation of fraud involved a Nobel Prize winner. It made it all the way to a congressional subcommittee. It went on for 10 years. So it's a very fascinating book. Just do a search if you don't want to look at this one called David Baltimore Fraud. I think you'll find it fascinating.
Thank you, Francis.
I love what you said in the beginning about, implications and consequences of misconduct. Sometimes they don't rise to big publicity in the news or in books written about them. But just recently, we were really excited about bringing somebody here to present on an issue, a great person. And we just Googled him to, write a bio, find some things about him. And it turns out that he was currently embroiled in research misconduct, which was really sad for us because he would have been great.
Yeah.
But, you don't want his presentation to be colored by what
Right.
others may Google. And so it's out there for everybody to see, and not just within your own institution or within, the government. It's out there.
Well, thank you guys so much for your time today.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you all for presenting. And if there are any other questions or comments, we have a couple more minutes, so feel free to put them in the chat or speak up. But if there's nothing else, we thank you both for being here today and presenting this to us. The presentation will be posted on the OCPD website in the coming weeks, along with the resources that Dr. Farrell shared in the chat. So
Perfect. Thank you.
well, everyone have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all.
Yes, take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. That was awesome.
Thank you. Yes, I agree. Looking forward to more things
For
like
sure.
this to come between the Virginia Tech and Carilion.
Yeah, that'll be awesome.
Coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.